All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the weekly Living Earth Collaborative in Washington University EEPB seminar series. So today is our first March seminar, and for March, we are celebrating the contributions of women to biology, and I hope you enjoyed the slideshow from the Biology Inclusion Committee that we've been playing before this seminar started. All right, so it is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Chris Prener. Dr. Prener got his bachelor's degree in sociology and history at St. Lawrence University and earned both his master's degree and PhD in sociology at Northeastern University. He's currently an assistant professor of sociology at St. Louis University. Dr. Prener is an urban and medical sociologist that is interested in using mixed methods research designs that incorporate spatial data to study a variety of topics. So for example, his upcoming book, Medicine at the Margins, which is slated to be published in September 2022 with Fordham University Press, documented his past research on urban emergency medical services. His current research is focusing on the historical origins of neighborhood stigmas and their contemporary consequences in the St. Louis region, which I believe we will hear more about today in his seminar. And in addition to pursuing these questions, Dr. Prener actively maintains several open source software projects to make spatial research more reproducible and St. Louis data more accessible. And you can find those on his website. He's also a maintainer of a COVID-19 tracking project for Missouri that focuses on harmonizing data from various sources to create data visualization that shows regional and statewide patterns in COVID cases, deaths, and health disparities. So I'm super excited for his talk today. Dr. Prener very kindly provided his slides, which you can find in the link in the YouTube description section if you want to access them during the talk. And before I hand it over to Dr. Prener, I just want to remind everyone to leave your comments and questions in the YouTube chat box anytime during the talk. And William and I will relay them to Dr. Prener at the end of the seminar. And so without taking up more of your time, please take it away, Dr. Prener.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Yusen. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to talk to you about my current research and the basis for what I'm hoping to be my second book, which is about St. Louis and our shared history and how that history matters today for both social outcomes and health disparities. Just a couple of thank yous. This work has been sponsored by both SLU, through the Office of the Vice President of Research and the Institute of Clinical and Translational Sciences at Washington University's Medical School. So I'm especially grateful to both of those entities, as well as the postdocs at the Living Earth Collaborative for extending the invitation and getting this all set up. So thank you all very much. What I want to do today, just tell you a little bit about myself quickly, and then talk about how I see kind of the basis of health disparities operating in St. Louis, both theoretically and historically. Give a quick example of how I see this play out with acute myocardial infarctions, so heart attacks, and then talk about some of the challenges we face to doing this work well and where I'm hoping to go in the next couple of years. So as Yusen said, I'm a medical and urban sociologist. I'm very interested in spatial computational methods, and I'm affiliated with a number of groups, both at SLU and my alma mater, Northeastern University, that are interested in marrying these interests together, health disparities, racial disparities, and how we improve public health. Been involved in a number of different research efforts, including my forthcoming book, which I'm super psyched about, on emergency medical services, as well as work on stigma and mental illness and literacy in mental illness, some broader issues and challenges that the St. Louis region faces, and then software development work to make all of this research more reproducible and improve access to public data that's out there, but is often very difficult to use. I'm taking various bits of these interests together and combining them into this new project that I'm calling Detrimental Influences, which is focused on St. Louis, but I think is generalizable to a lot of American cities. The term comes from these maps some of you may have seen before that were produced in the 1930s and the 1940s. And I'll talk about these maps a little later on in the topic, but detrimental influences become one of the ways that the map makers here described neighborhoods that had either large populations of African Americans or large populations of immigrants. And the real kind of overarching motivating question is, what is the meaning of early 20th century racism today, right? What are its long-term consequences for contemporary urban life and health? As I said, this is work that's being funded in part by the ICTS at WashU. I have an R01 that's currently under review, so fingers crossed for some good outcomes there. And then I'm revising my NSF proposal. I also have a research initiative that has not been formally announced yet, but is launching in July 2022, which is going to support some of this work. I'll talk a little bit about that connection at the end. And is the subject, like I said, of what's going to be book number 2. And the core question that I kind of want to focus on today, right, is given what we know historically about these neighborhoods, what is the meaning of that history for something like heart disease rates today, both in North City as well as North County and in majority white areas of St. Louis, like the southwest part of the city and parts of West County. And I think to begin, I want to tell you just a little bit about how I see racism operating here in terms of heart disease and other health outcomes. As a sociologist, the theory that I sort of gravitate towards as I think about this is something called fundamental cause theory, which basically argues that a couple of different key social mechanisms are the root driving forces behind health disparities in our society. The original formulation, which comes from an article by Bruce Link, Joe Phelan in 1995, really focuses on socioeconomic status. But there's a couple of people, and they're listed down sort of at the bottom of the slide here, that have argued that there are also mechanisms related to racism that make racism also one of these core fundamental features that drive health disparities. And so I sort of think of these as the underlying foundation on which the social determinants of health are built. So these key things outside of our own individual biology and genetics that we know influence our health status. Beyond those institutions are racism and socioeconomic status. And I want to be really clear that I see the racism as the fundamental operating feature here and not race. Right. So, sort of in line with sociology's disciplinary view of race, which is that a social construction and not something that is like a biologically valid category. And so it's racism in the way we treat people that influences people's health outcomes and not this socially fabricated idea of race that we retroactively apply to people. And we've been retroactively applying that to people and engaging in those acts of racism for a very long time. You can go back to the early 1900s, W.E.B. Du Bois, who's the first real sociologist in my mind, a real empirical sociologist, not just doing like armchair philosophy, basically. He looks out at the 20th century when he writes this book, The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903. And he says, listen, the color line, i.e. the institution of racism in our society, this is going to be the 20th century's most pressing problem. I think you don't need to know a ton about the 20th century in the United States to recognize that this is an incredibly prescient observation. But it's an observation where we've really focused on understanding these dynamics in, at least for sociology, in a relatively small number of cities. Urban sociologists sort of gravitate towards cities where we have long-standing, really prestigious PhD programs. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles. This is kind of the center of gravity for urban sociology. And one of the things that I've argued is that our discipline needs to shake ourselves away from that legacy and really focus on cities that are outside of the coasts. That we need a broader, geographically speaking literature that gets into the American South, both literally and metaphorically, but also a deeper literature that really engages with the specific histories and social mechanisms at work in cities. And I use St. Louis in this 2020 article. I use St. Louis as an example. And we're an incredibly important city for understanding American racism. I highly recommend the book Broken Heart of America, which just brilliantly lays out, right, the ways in which St. Louis over the 19th century and the 20th century operates as this kind of laboratory for the institution of white supremacy in our country. And, regardless of your academic discipline, just sort of by virtue of being associated with WashU or SLU or living in St. Louis, I think this is an essential story to understand. Missouri is at the heart of so much of what becomes the American experience with racism. We just, as a state, we just celebrated our bicentennial, right? 200 years of Missouri. And our very existence is predicated on the expansion of slavery into this new territory, the Missouri Territory, right? So Missouri comes into the Union as a state, as a slave state. At the same time, Maine is admitted as a free state. So to attempt to keep some semblance of balance in our institutions between those states where slavery was legal and those where it was not. When Missouri is founded in 1821, our first constitution includes an effort to actually make it illegal for Black people to reside in Missouri unless they were enslaved. So racism is at the heart of our state's founding, both in terms of the expansion of slavery, but also, in our state's first constitution. We are a military center for American westward expansion. Settler colonialism is headquartered here in St. Louis. It is where the U.S. Army during the 19th century sets its sights on indigenous nations throughout the American West and, manages their expulsion to smaller and smaller chunks of land and eventually reservations. This is, it's one of the reasons Missouri has no federally recognized tribes that are, located here today, not because indigenous people never occupied this space, but because they were forcibly removed by the United States. Missourians are also, essential to expanding the institution of slavery ever westward. We now know that, William Eliot, WashU's founder, was very opposed to abolitionism. SLU's legacy in terms of the institution of slavery is more well documented and is really extensive. The Jesuits at SLU owned slaves, ran a plantation in North County. There were slaves present on our campus before the Civil War. Missourians, including members of the Catholic Church from St. Louis, moved westward into Kansas in the 1850s and beforehand, and brought enslaved people with them in violation of the Missouri Compromise. And it's Missourians who waged this guerrilla war in the 1850s. That's part of the expansion of slavery. The Missouri, St. Louis, right, we're also where, one of the most deplorable Supreme Court decisions in American history gets its start, the Dred Scott decision, which finds that Dred Scott did not have standing to sue his owner because he was property. And as property, he did not have the ability to bring a lawsuit in federal court in the United States. This, just shatters the Missouri Compromise. It, along with Bleeding Kansas, sets the stage for the American Civil War. So, our 19th century history is essential to understanding why St. Louis looks the way that it does, right? We start building these building blocks very early, and we expand on them and create a really, really segregated city in the 20th century. In St. Louis, we practice every major form of racial residential segregation policy, all of which, I should say, is in part driven by policymakers, but is also driven by the group that becomes the St. Louis Real Estate Agent Association today, which is called St. Louis Realtors. So, the key institutions are at work in enabling this. This includes something called exclusionary zoning, where in 1917, voters in St. Louis went to the polls and voted about 75% to 25% in favor of actually identifying areas that would become Black neighborhoods and baking that into our zoning laws. This also prevented Black families from moving into white majority blocks, for example, and included, this really graphic kind of a propaganda that's handed out. It's this photograph of West Bell Place in St. Louis, showing, with X marks written on it, right? These are homes that went from white owners to Black owners, and you need to save your home. It's just sort of like this very naked racism at work here. This is, as a matter of public policy, is not around very long. The Supreme Court pretty quickly ruled that it was unconstitutional, not based on a case from St. Louis, but from a different case. And so it's not practiced for very long, but you get a sense, right, of like 20th century housing segregation and where it starts to come from, right? The attitudes that enable exclusionary zoning to be passed. We also practice this form of segregation called deed covenants. What this was homeowners or homeowner associations put language into the legal paperwork that makes your home yours. And it banned homeowners from selling their home to African Americans, to people with Asian ethnicity. Sometimes there were religious groups that were identified in these. St. Louis, these are widely applied in the city. The home at the left there is where the Shelley family lived, up in the Ville in North St. Louis City. They are ultimately the reason that deed covenants are ruled unenforceable in the entire United States. They were sued by the neighborhood association using money from a local Protestant church, who ruled that they should have never been able to buy their house. And the Supreme Court disagreed and said that cities could no longer enforce these deed covenants. So St. Louis occupies a very important part of legal history around the ultimate dismantling of some of these practices. I mentioned these maps at the beginning, detrimental influences, and I'll talk more about them now and in a few minutes, but we're what is called a red line city. So we have a city, this is the 1937 map, where realtors and real estate appraisers sort of went around at the behest of the federal government, something called the Homeowner Loan Association, and identified neighborhoods, right, that were seen as potentially in decline, and labeled them with yellow or red zones. And this is where this term redlining comes from that I'm going to talk about. So this is heavily applied first in 1937 and then again in 1940, which had a more expansive negative view of where St. Louis city's trajectory was headed. And these types of assessments, right, of St. Louis City as sort of declining and problematic, become the primary motivation for urban renewal programs and some clearance. If you've been downtown to the Arch Grounds and visited, the courthouse where the Dred Scott's the state court decisions were originally heard, you're on this former neighborhood that is just obliterated in the 1940s. You can see the remains of that neighborhood here. This is the swath, 39, 40 blocks of land that are just bulldozed to make way for what then was this sort of unknown idea, but ultimately becomes the Gateway Arch. This happens, in other parts of St. Louis as well, including a portion of St. Louis University's campus, which sits on a former Black neighborhood called the Mill Creek Valley. And the sort of evaluations that redlining captures, were part of the justification for doing this. Redlining as it was practiced involved these appraisers going around to different neighborhoods, both in cities and in sort of inner suburbs, and rating different areas as either best, still desirable, definitely declining, or hazardous. For example, Ladue, a West St. Louis County suburb, is given the best rating because, according to the appraisers, there's not a single foreigner or Negro who lives there, right? So it's the actual justification for these labels is very clearly racialized. Often appraisers would talk about, the sort of what they saw as the infiltration of a quote unquote lower grade population as a reason for applying this yellow C grade to parts of cities. And then hazardous areas, unlike, the best rating, were seen as having detrimental influences, which is where the name for my book proposal and this project comes from. Based on the presence of what raters, identified as an undesirable population. If you've been to Walmart in Richmond Heights, right, there's like a Walmart and a Menards right along Hanley Road there. That's this former neighborhood called Lincoln Terrace, no longer exists. It is cleared to make way ultimately for their shopping centers. But the initial clearance, right, is motivated by the presence of African-American residents. And that is reflected in these redlining maps. Lincoln Terrace was redlined because, and seen as having, and you can see in the definition there, little to no value because of the presence of Black folks. Like I said, in 1940, red and yellow grades were heavily assigned to St. Louis City, as well as a couple notable parts of St. Louis County. If we look at our contemporary zip code geography today, there are zip codes largely in North St. Louis City and South St. Louis City, where a majority of them had, a majority of their area was assigned either a C or a D grade. And this rating from like the 1930s, 1940s is still, decently correlated with something like poverty today in St. Louis. The Pearson's R value is 0.75, so not a terribly weak correlation at all. And our geography of poverty looks somewhat similar to that geography of redlining. And this is, this for me, right, is the motivating question. What is the continued relevance, not just of redlining, but the places where deed covenants existed, the places where exclusionary zoning was practiced, and how does all of this fit together to inform our current geography of racism in St. Louis City? And I'll give you one kind of take on how that geography has grown and changed over time with something called the Index of Concentration at the Extremes. It has a kind of, at least for contemporary politics in the United States, an unfortunate acronym, which is ICE. But it's a measure of segregation that I like because it gives us something like a correlation coefficient measure that can be calculated for small areas, like a census tract, which is what I'll show you here. And it relies on a comparison between a privileged group and a marginalized group. And so I'm going to conceptualize white as representing privilege today, and having a large number of African-American residents as representing marginalization. Here are 4 snapshots, kind of small multiples, if you will, of how segregation unfolds between when those redlining maps were made and today. You can see that at the very beginning of the 1950s, if you lean into your screen a little bit, it's really like the central corridor of St. Louis City is where we see a high degree of segregation for African Americans. Those red values, those highly negative values, those are highly segregated Black spaces. Over the course of the 1970s, as white flight ensues from the city of St. Louis, we see that highly segregated area expand westward to the city line and northward, right, towards like Natural Bridge Avenue. By 1990, it's the majority of North St. Louis City that is highly segregated, along with some beginnings of pockets in North County. I think it's helpful to remember that Ferguson, for example, at the 1970 census, has virtually no African Americans living there. But by the 2010 census, you can see, right, North County has become increasingly segregated. Now, how does this compare to redlining? Well, the story changes over time. There is a sort of growing in magnitude, moderate set of correlations. Again, they're negative, so more associated with those negative values. And what I'm going to ask in just a minute here is, given that there is some relationship between redlining and segregation today, how are both of those things implicated in the geography of one health disparity, which is poor heart health? But first, a couple additional points. All the way up to 2018, you can see the correlation coefficient negative 0.5. Again, negative makes sense because it basically means like as a space becomes more segregated for African Americans, so it becomes more negative, right? The amount of redlining area increases. And like I said, I think it's critical to view this in a historical lens. Louis Wacquant, who's a sociologist, argues that we've started sort of four critical pieces. He calls them peculiar institutions, right? These four successive historically linked periods in the United States where racism and the economy are directly intertwined, beginning with the institution of slavery and then the institution of Jim Crow, followed by Northern ghettoization, something that St. Louis very clearly experiences, even though it would locate us sort of socio-politically in the metaphorical American South. And then finally, the sort of hyper-ghettoization, right, and the use of mass incarceration as tools to manage what before were sort of managed economically, Wacquant argues. And these are the things that I see feeding our contemporary disparities. Right? These are the sort of layers that form the structure on which health disparities and the social determinants of health are built. Wacquant is somewhat explicit about this, that not only are they sort of the layers that disparities are built on, but they're also, right, there's this sort of mutually this mutual relationship between racism and our economy, right? That all of these periods in time, right, represent an evolution of American capitalism, right? These are all economic practices. And so in addition to taking this kind of fundamental cause racism perspective, I think that racial capitalism is another essential piece of the puzzle here. This is an idea that is old. W.B. Du Bois writes about this. Cedric Robinson is the person sort of most closely associated with racial capitalism, but it's basically the idea that, right, racial and economic exploitation go hand in hand. This is an argument I make in a recent paper about segregation in St. Louis, including a paper where some of those graphics I just showed you are drawn from. And so, understanding St. Louis's economic structure as being racialized, as being a product of racism, I think is just critical to understanding, our relationship with, like I said, health disparities. So I'm going to give you a little example just of how I think about this, and then talk about some of the data challenges to doing this work well through AMI. Which is an acronym for acute myocardial infarction. That is a consequence of something called coronary heart disease, right? So when our hearts start to accumulate plaque and become narrowed, right, that reduced blood flow causes disease in our hearts, coronary heart disease. If arteries become occluded, the heart muscle can be damaged, and we call that an acute myocardial infarction. Normal people call it a heart attack. We know, and we have a pretty decent literature on this, that there are disparities for African Americans in terms of risk factors and cardiac outcomes, including higher rates of CHD morbidity and mortality, as well as African Americans experiencing higher rates of AMI. But looking at segregation and racism is not something that often shows up. Right. So, for example, this annual review of public health article from 2009 is like the canonical reference for understanding how place and coronary heart disease are intertwined. But there's not a single mention of racism or race. Right? It is solely really focused on socioeconomic inequality across geography. And so I've got a paper just out just a few months ago in November with a couple of colleagues on how we haven't really rectified this problem, right? We tend to talk about racial disparities without naming racism in the cardiac disease literature. This leaves the door open to a biological explanation for why health disparities exist, and I would very much like to shut that door, both for heart disease, other poor health outcomes. Some of the literature is getting better at kind of acknowledging the presence of social determinants of health. For example, there's a couple articles that look at proximity to highways as a risk factor for heart disease. But those articles never mentioned that, interstate construction in the United States specifically targeted Black neighborhoods in the 1950s and the 1960s because there was this view, and also immigrant neighborhoods, there was this view that those were places where they could easily, right, obtain the land needed for these highways. So the connection to racism is just always unexplored in the literature, and I think it's critical to bring it in. To do this in a very quick and simple way, I've got 5 years of hospitalization data from the state of Missouri through this database called MOFIMS. Notice how old it is. This is one issue for me, right? We don't have good small area, up-to-date small area health outcomes data in Missouri or really much of the United States. I'm gonna pair those data up with redlining boundaries and also some demographic data from the same period for the American Community Survey. Whip it all together using, I primarily work with open source tools, so R and RStudio. I'm going to show you a couple of maps here, a descriptive map, and then a spatial autocorrelation map, which basically gives us a sense of how AMI hospitalization rates cluster in space, and then show you an OLS model here at the end. An OLS model, I will say, that does not appear to be biased by the presence of spatial autocorrelation, which is a really important analytical check to make. Over that period of time, 2011 to 2015, these are the per capita rates of AMI hospitalizations. And I want to be clear, this is a measure of hospitalizations and not actual AMIs. And so there is a little bit of kind of healthcare utilization, right, that this is capturing, and not just disease incidence. It's not the easiest map to kind of identify where clustering is, and that's one of the reasons I like to use measures of spatial autocorrelation. So these red zones here, these are neighborhoods with, or census tracts really, I shouldn't call them neighborhoods, census tracts that have high hospitalization rates and are surrounded by other areas with high hospitalization rates. And you can see there is this cluster right in North St. Louis City, right? High hospitalization rates. And this is kind of the signal that, I look for in my work to sort of help me empirically identify the presence of health disparities. Like I said, what I'm really interested in is, okay, this is a contemporary health outcome. I expect contemporary socioeconomic status and potentially contemporary racial composition to matter, perhaps, for these disparities, but is it possible that redlining also matters? And if so, why might it be that this thing from the 1940s creates a geography that's still relevant today? So I've got a couple OLS maps here. The first is just redlining and our outcome, so AMI hospitalizations, and it doesn't explain a whole lot at all. And when we add in contemporary, the second model adds in contemporary racial residential segregation as measured by ICE. You can see that there's this negative coefficient, which is, again, it's what we'd expect, because ICE, the more negative ICE is, the more concentrated African Americans are in that given aerial units. And it's a decent, a decent effect size. And the adjusted R squared really bumps up. AIC, BIC go down. So we're doing a little bit better in terms of our model fit here. And then I bring in a bunch of socioeconomic variables, right? So this is the other predominant fundamental cause, socioeconomic status. What happens when we include median income, labor force participation, owner-occupied housing, which is often used as a kind of proxy for socioeconomic stability in neighborhoods, as well as the vacancy rates using the Census Bureau's definition of vacancy, which is different than often how I think people identify vacancy, really focused on residential vacancy here. And what's fascinating to me is that redlining measure remains statistically significant at a similar, very small effect size, but there's still potentially some signal there. But it's negative, right? Not positive. And you'd expect as redlining to go up, maybe if there's a health disparity that you would expect like more people to be using healthcare. But really what we're saying here is that redline areas, people actually are using less of it, which I'll put a pin in and I'll come back to in a second. But first, the rest of the coefficients, all show that there is some mix of socioeconomic factors that influence variation in hospitalizations. The model is still not a great fit, in terms of there's a lot of unexplained variance. But I think the redlining measure is really fascinating, right? And one of the possibilities is that despite the fact that we know generally that African Americans have a higher risk of CHD morbidity as well as AMIs, people's ability to be hospitalized for that or their decision to seek care may be such that actually there's an effect of living in redlined areas that limits that access. Perhaps these are areas where there is a lack of health insurance, or there is not access to healthcare in a sort of equal way. The big problem I have with these models, besides the fairly small amount of variance explains, is that redlining is potentially associated with these other factors as well. And one of the focuses, right, like so redlining may not just predict AMI hospitalization, but is also potentially associated with the other predictors, right, like segregation today and socioeconomic composition today. So one of the things I'm doing with my ICTS grant is working with a WashU sociologist, Michael Esposito, and looking at better ways to model this, to essentially, kind of put redlining in its place, statistically speaking, so that we can understand the sort of the right ordering of how all these things are interrelated. So there's a methods issue here, but it's also there's a data issue that I want to flag before I stop. Measuring health in place in the United States is just so fraught and so frustrating, right? I wish we were a Nordic country that had these, all population patient registries that have all kinds of detailed information on health outcomes and socioeconomic status. And we're just not that place, right? Our healthcare infrastructure is highly balkanized. This has been a real challenge for me in doing my COVID work, for example, that drawing data from across Missouri to funnel into my COVID project is really challenging because the data is in all these different places. We don't have kind of a central repository of healthcare data. And so, my COVID work has really relied on all this harmonization. And very often, for all the work that I'm doing here, right, like the best I can do below the county level is zip codes, right? We have an over reliance on zip codes to do this healthcare, to do our small area healthcare work. And it's because zip codes are in electronic health records, right? Everyone, it's part of the billing process, part of the contact process is you share your zip code and something everyone has. But like no one sort of goes out and walks their zip code, right? So zip codes aren't neighborhoods. Also, zip codes aren't areas on a map. They are actually lines that postal carriers walk or drive that we want to imagine as areas on a map. So they're just this really flawed is Freudian slip, the flawed flawed aerial units, right, for doing any kind of spatial work, but it's also really common because it's easy to ascertain. So we've got this methods challenge, right? How do we do better modeling? But I also have this data challenge, right? How do we get better measures, sub-county measures of health outcomes? Zip codes are just like one of the challenges there. So in addition, right, I mentioned I did this, AMI analysis on data from 2011 to 2015. And that is an analysis I did earlier in 2020. And that was the most recent data, right? So it's like 5 years out of date. Early in the pandemic, when I was working with what became Prepare STL to sort of identify areas where we were concerned about population risks for poorer COVID outcomes, we were using the same data, right? Data that's like 4 years out of date, 5 years out of date, to try to understand that geography of risk. So that fact that MoFIMS is so out of date and other common sources often run like multiple years behind is a real challenge. And then they're just not updated that often, right? You can't do good longitudinal data. Usually the best you get are kind of yearly updates. So I think this is a critically important question. I think it's something, we have to address just as residents of the St. Louis area to grapple with how racism matters in our lives. It has impacts on our health outcomes. We need to do a better modeling job, but we need better data to do that. In addition to the other challenges I raised, the data are often isolated. We'll get health outcomes data that's just a single hospital system or just a single payer source. Accessing the data can be a nightmare. My COVID work has been really challenging, right? Because data are not posted in particularly accessible ways. So a lot of computer science knowledge goes into doing a lot of web scraping. API access is needed to access these data. And then kind of the best data, something that we call, health insurance data, like all payer claims data, right? There can be real significant barriers to just getting the data. And so, if you're not a well-funded researcher, or worse, you're a community organization that wants to use these data, forget about it because the cost is so high. And that gets me kind of to the last challenge that I see doing this work. We have a sense in sociology, it's honestly kind of a dirty word, public sociology, right? Doing work that is for public good and not just for academic intellectual insights. It leads me to ask this question: if I believe that racism is a fundamental force that shapes our lives in St. Louis and around the United States, and we are looking at health disparities that directly touch on the lives of people, the lives of my neighbors, right? But people can't access the data about themselves, who are we doing this work for? And what is our responsibility to the St. Louis community or wherever we happen to be doing our research, whether it's here, elsewhere in the United States, or somewhere else around the world? And so as a part of kind of framing this book and doing the empirical work that I want to do around redlining, really what it's led me to is we need to create better sub-county measures of health. And that is something I'm kind of actively involved in right now. We actually think we've identified a really good source for doing this that would make us, I hope, a national leader in identifying sub-county health metrics. And happy coincidence, right? It's data that would also be really crucial to, right, painting this portrait about how early 20th century racism matters for contemporary urban life and health. Right. And so the questions I'm kind of grappling with right now, as I think about this new research initiative that I'm hoping to launch this summer, as I apply for federal grants, is right, how can we take existing data that's often expensive or difficult to access and do a better job than anyone else is doing in the US right now? How do we frame these out to engage not just questions of health disparities, but to work with community partners and really help draw our policy attention on neighborhoods that are most harmed by structural racism? And then finally, just as a matter of clinical practice, I think when I talk to physicians, I always feel bad because I'm telling folks, right, racism matters, and where you live matters. And I think, folks are very receptive to those ideas, but, you can't prescribe a new residence for your patients, right? You can't tell them to move in a helpful or a meaningful way, right? So finally, right, how do we translate this into clinical practice and ultimately, start undoing the consequences, not just of racism in our society, but medical racism as well? So like I said, I'm sort of deeply in the weeds right now, thinking about not just, how should we see racism? How does it relate to contemporary health outcomes? But how do we methodologically and in terms of data do better? And it's a very active process for which I don't have an end, but I'm happy to talk more about if folks have questions. So there's a link here, probably tough to read on the slides, my contact info, and a link to the slides, but I think that's also on YouTube. So with that, I will stop yakking and see if there's any questions that have come in.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Prener, for the fascinating talk. So we have a few minutes or a few seconds of delays on the YouTube side of things, so we're gonna wait a little bit to see if the questions are rolling in. But while we wait, I'm gonna ask my question. So this is a kind of a methods question. So I'm wondering, like in your OLS models, the ordinary least square models, so are there do the explanatory variables have correlation between them? So because I'm really intrigued by the flip of the effect of redlining, and I'm wondering if there are correlations between the explanatory variables and if that's potentially leading to multicollinearities and influencing the interpretation of the data.
Yeah, I mean, in those models, there is some correlation. It was not so problematic, in terms of like post hoc model checking that I didn't feel comfortable sharing the models. But it's always a challenging, right? Especially if theoretically you believe that race and socioeconomic status are these mutually constructive things, then it would stand to reason that highly segregated spaces are also going to have a particular socioeconomic profile, which then has these really critical methodological implications. So I don't think it's a serious bias on those models, but it's certainly a challenge kind of with doing this work more generally.
So kind of a follow-up, how do you, besides the model checking, how do you usually deal with these problems in terms of interpretation when you're having these potentially correlated factors in the model?
There's a couple different things, right? So one is to pick your favorite measures of socioeconomic status because you can't use them all. Another, there's some different indexes that are out there, indices. So there's one from Wisconsin, the Area Deprivation Index, that you could put into a model kind of in place of picking your own favorite measures of the ACS, to helpfully, at least adjust for multicollinearity between the SES indicators. The problem I have with the area deprivation measure is it's a black box, right? They don't fully publish the methods. So you don't exactly know what you're fitting. There's another one, the Social Vulnerability Index, which is a CDC product. And there you know exactly what goes into it. It's a whole range of socioeconomic indicators, but they also include racial composition as an indicator of vulnerability. And so from a theoretical level, I have a problem with this because I actually think that racism causes vulnerability and is not an outcome of vulnerability, right? So the way the CDC conceptualizes that, I think, is challenging. But they published all their methods. You could certainly take the theme with race in it out and just use the sort of more genuinely SES measures. Downside there is there's a lot of tinkering and it's only published every 2 years. Though I spent an afternoon and updated it for 2020 at the county level for a collaboration on COVID booster shots that I'm working on right now. So it's it's doable. But there's certainly there's no one good answer, but those are two common ways that people are trying to address this question of multicollinearity.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Hi, William.
Hey, indeed, really fascinating talk, seminar. Thank you. And for me, it's really interesting, the history of San Luis and also the reality of San Luis in the terms of racism and all the results that you show. We have here different questions now. The questions are coming in the chat. So we have this question from Jonathan Losos. He says, thanks for the fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I have two questions. First, sorry if I missed this, but how exactly is ICE calculated? Do you want me to read the second question, or you want to?
Yeah, go ahead and give me the second question, and then we'll.
All right. The second is, you state that you would like to close the door on the idea that there is a biological explanation for variation in AMI incidence. Could you expand? Did you again? Is it data don't support it?
So I heard part of that about closing the door.
I think, William, your internet is breaking up, so I'm going to reread the question for you.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so the second question is on you state that you'd like to close the door on the idea that there is a biological explanation for variation in AMI incidence. Could you expand on this? Like, are you against the idea in principle, or is it that you think the data don't support it?
Yeah, sure. Both great questions. Thank you. So first, in terms of how ICE is calculated, here's the formula again. So it's basically dividing, you take the privileged group, subtract from it the marginalized population, then divide by total population. And like I said, it gives us a measure between -1 and 1 that we can calculate for small areas, which is really useful compared to other ways that we calculate segregation. The other question, I am opposed to it at like a theoretical level, right? The idea that a biological force or genetic, factors explain racial disparities implies that race itself is this biological phenomenon. And we know, sort of at the genetic level, right, there's more variation within continental racial groups than there is between continental racial groups. We'll use measures, like Asian or Latino as if they're these self-evident categories, when Central and South America and Asia are these enormous, very diverse places, culturally, linguistically, socially, that don't hang together in meaningful ways, whether we're doing anthropological work or sociological work or genetic work. And so I want to close the door, on thinking that these continental racial groups are influential in their own right. That doesn't mean that I don't think that ethnicity matters, right, as a narrower construct. But this broad idea that, African American or Latino are these biologically self-evident categories, and I'm sort of like conceptually opposed to.
Thank you for the answer.
Yeah.
Right. I'm gonna ask the next question. So this is from an account called Riverwatch Coordinator, and they said in the slides on ICE, I think you mentioned that as North St. Louis transitioned from dark blue to dark red, it was becoming more segregated. Is this more segregated or differently segregated?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's differently segregated. Yeah, so it is an awesome question, and my language is not always maybe as precise as it should be here. So these really dark blue areas, right, they're also highly segregated. They're just highly segregated for white folks. And so what happens is this transition from North St. Louis as a highly segregated white space outside of the Ville to North St. Louis as this highly segregated Black space. So yes, they are differently segregated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for answering. I'm curious. So you showed that over time segregation was increasing. Can you expect kind of the same trajectory in the next 10 or 30 years? Or what do you expect in the trajectory?
Yeah, I'm not in the forecasting business, but right, the fundamental mechanisms that I see driving expanded racism, or expanded racial residential segregation, right, have not really changed. The practices that undergird a lot of this in the early 20th century, those are all nominally illegal, but enforcement remains spotty. There's also lots of cultural practices, for example, so there's something called steering, where real estate agents will sort of say, you should really look here. And so I want to show you these houses, right? And there's a racial script that follows, even if it remains kind of unstated. So there is a plethora of ways in which, segregation remains kind of actively reconstructed over time. And while, again, I'm not kind of in the business of forecasting, I don't see those fundamentals changing. Right. So I would be surprised, when our 2020 ACS data comes out in March. It's March. So when it comes out this month, knock on wood, it's going to come out. And when we finally get, the full release of the 2020 census, and as we see these data products evolve, I would be surprised to see the narrative really change. And I will use this moment too to plug, there has been discussion about whether the American Community Survey should continue to be done by the Census Bureau, given the cost of doing these nationwide probability samples. And this is essential to doing this work, is to have these yearly data releases that allow us to, ask the very question you're asking, William, and to kind of continue to revisit it. And so, I think the American Community Survey is absolutely vital. And I certainly hope the Census Bureau and Congress continue to support that process into the future.
Thank you. So you said I think my next question, kind of like following up the previous one, will also be kind of broad and like shooting into a dark question. So you kind of like in your answer said that you don't see these very like big principles that cause like segregation and disparities changing. And so what do you think looking forward is kind of how could policies or other things potentially mitigate these principles that are underlying what we're experiencing right now? And I guess what are the ways in sociology to kind of evaluate the effectiveness of those policies?
Yeah, so I think some of it is there's a legal question about enforcing things like fair housing laws that are not always equitably enforced. But access to housing, I think, is critical. And we have a significant gap in wealth between white families and Black families and Latino families in the United States. And that is a gap in wealth that will take literal centuries to close from now if we do nothing, and means that it's very hard for Black and Latino families to have the money they need, not just to buy a house, but to weather something like a car breaking down, right? And so we need economic policy that is focused on equity, that gives people the resources they need to manage all of the many challenges we face in life, including, right, stable housing, and being able to purchase a home. And so I think it's that type of policy that's really critical, right? Like, how do we undo the financial harm of racial capitalism over the last 4 centuries? That means proactively addressing the ways that race and economic prosperity are intertwined in the United States now. And that touches on a lot of things. I think this appears in all kinds of policies, from healthcare policy and how we give people health insurance, to how we fund and support public education in the United States. So I think, to your second question, right, like, how are sociologists kind of positioned to evaluate that? One of the things I love about sociology, we're like the big tent of the social sciences, right? So there's political sociologists and economic sociologists, sociologists of education. And so we have, substantively, we have this like really deep bench of people that, unlike me, are experts in education and are really well positioned to evaluate how, changing funding models for public education to increase equity does that work. And so I think it's about being present. It's about being intentional, designing interventions from the beginning that include research and evaluation, that explicitly state that racial equity is an essential facet of that policy. And that's something that sociology is hopefully well positioned to advocate for as well.
Okay, thank you for the answers. And so we are at 5 p.m. So I think we're gonna wrap up on. So thank you again, Dr. Prener. And I'm sure everyone is clapping their hands in their respective places in front of their computer. So thank you for the seminar, and thank you everyone for coming. And we will see you all next week. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.